And the first thing we show here is the United Nations headquarters. It's on the East River in New York City, Midtown Manhattan, on land donated by the Rockefeller family. Surprise, surprise. Right? I have another version of this talk, and I go on to say that a lot of people say, you don't have to worry about the United Nations, it's a do-nothing organization. It's just a lot of people that blow enough steam and they don't really accomplish anything. And they use the word bloviate. I love that word, right? That's a good word. But here's a whole building full of people there doing nothing. And on the other version I have of this, I show the World Food Headquarters and the world this and the world that, all around the globe. Big buildings full of people doing nothing. Right? So we want to be careful and realize that it's not a do-nothing organization. Okay, now we already talked about this in the talk I gave on Monday, the Tower of Babel and the beginning of nationhood. Let me take these and put them over here. I think that's a very key point that a lot of people who like the Bible and like to talk about what's in the Bible and how we should stand by the Bible and so forth, how they should recall the story of the Tower of Babel, because that's when nationhood began. And if it began there, and that's what God wanted, and He didn't want world government, then there's a lesson there. And I think we ought to make much more of a big deal out of it than we have. Okay, now the goal has always been world government, and we can trace the history of the world government advocates from Adam Weishaupt in 1776 to Mazzini in the early 1800s, to Karl Marx in the mid-1800s, to Edward Mandell House, and we'll show a picture of him in a little while in this program. These are all people who wanted world government. Here's House's book. Edward Mandell House was Wilson's chief advisor. Edward Mandell House is a man who had successfully gotten 4 different governors in the state of Texas elected. He was from Texas. And he was a political manipulator. He was able to accomplish that. And after doing that and getting 4 governors in the state of Texas, he set his sights a little bit higher, and he moved to New York City. And after he moved to New York City, he befriended the governor of New Jersey, a man named Woodrow Wilson, who later became the President of the United States. House and Wilson became inseparable. Some of the quotes are kind of eerie about this man is my alter ego, he's my other self, he's this, that, back and forth. They loved each other. So House wrote this book in 1912. And he wrote it at his summer home in Gloucester, Massachusetts. In 1912, President Roosevelt, President Wilson, soon to be president, he left the convention. Now wait a minute, I'm backing up here. It was 1932. House was already a political manipulator who had started the Council on Foreign Relations, so on. House was at his summer home in Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1932 when Roosevelt won the Democrat nomination in Chicago, and he went all the way over to Gloucester, Massachusetts. He didn't even go home, he went straight to Gloucester, Massachusetts to visit House, which means it was all in the bag right from the beginning. All right, here, Edward Mandell House and his book, Philip Drew, Administrator. The dedicatory quote in the book. Now, when you write a book, you put a quote at the beginning and you kind of dedicate the book to somebody. He dedicated the book to Giuseppe Mazzini, who was Weishaupt's successor. So he became the top advisor to Wilson and FDR. In his book, he said he wanted socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He despised the U.S. Constitution, He advocated income tax and Federal Reserve. We got both during the Wilson administration. He proposed world government, and then he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the launching of the Council on Foreign Relations happened in 1919 at a meeting held in Paris when House and his confreres were over in Europe working on the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. They got word that the U.S. Senate had turned thumbs down on the League of Nations. So when they turned thumbs down on the League of Nations, these guys got together with British counterparts and they formed organizations for their countries. And one of the ones that was formed was the CFR in New York City. Edward Mandell House was its founder. Okay, 1919, the Senate voted on joining the League of Nations, and they said no. But they debated the matter for 9 months. Now keep that figure 9 months in hand. That's something to remember, because we're going to talk about how long they debated whether or not we should get in the UN. Here's World War II breaking out. That's at Pearl Harbor. And 1 month after Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th, 1941, 1 month later, 26 nations issued a formal Declaration of the United Nations. That's the first time that the term United Nations had been used. In 1943, Allied nations met. US, United Kingdom, USSR, China, and others agreed to form a world government. 1944, there was a conference at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington. Dumbarton Oaks is a big estate in Washington, D.C. They issued an initial draft of the UN Charter. And in 1945, San Francisco Conference, 50 nations were present, and they produced the final UN Charter, and the United States very quickly signed on to the UN Charter. The Secretary General of the UN's founding conference was this man, Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was found out later to have been a secret communist the whole time. Chief authors of the UN Charter, this happens to be wrong, and it's my era. It wasn't Andrei Gromyko, it was Andrei Vyshinsky. Vyshinsky and Hiss. So we had the chief authors of the United Nations Charter were a communist from Russia and a communist from the United States. Okay? Now, how many in this room have ever read the Charter of the United Nations? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Well, I think more people ought to read it. All right? You find out how subversive the United Nations is. The U.S. delegation at the UN founding, this was the meeting held in San Francisco during April, May, and June of 1945. We had 16 secret communists among our delegation, and we had 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Were there any good guys? I don't think so. I've looked over the list. I didn't see anybody that I would say was a good guy. 1945, the Senate voted to join the UN. All right? Now remember that they debated whether to join the League of Nations in 1919 for how many months?
9.
9 months. Right? In 6 days, they debated whether or not to join the UN, and they voted 89 to 2. Only 2 senators said no. Now everybody knows the names of those 2 senators, right?
Yeah.
You've all heard of Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota, haven't you? Haven't you?
Yes.
Those are the 2, right?
Was Robert Taft not a senator there?
Robert Taft was a senator. Robert Taft voted go into the UN. We'll get to Taft later in the program here, all right? It's disappointing to know that, but he regretted it later on. All right, so someday we're going to build a monument to Langer and Shipstead, right? All right, here they are. Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota, William Langer of North Dakota. There was a California senator named Hiram Johnson. And he would have voted no, but illness kept him from participating. So it really boiled down to, there were three stalwart opponents. Here's the Charter of the UN, and I know you can't read it, but I just thought I'd throw it up there. It does exist. Right? The UN Charter, Article 1, they use the word peace 6 times. So they always say they're a peace organization. Right? But Article 2 discusses the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7, which means that the organization is for war. Enforcement measures, that's a fancy word for war. Right? So they claim to be a peace organization, and yet they support war. Chapter 7, that's referenced right there in Article 2, authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. Is that not war? Yes, it is. It is war. Okay. Where does the UN get its military forces, if it's going to have any? Article 43 says, all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Now, peace to a communist has always meant opposition, no opposition to communism. Peace to the United Nations is the same. No opposition to the United Nations. Right? So we got to be careful here. Okay, now, let's suppose here, all members of the United Nations, this is Article 43, this is what was signed, this is what we're supposed to be doing because we're a member of the UN. All members of the UN undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Right? Right? Okay. Well, let's suppose you're a U.S. Senator, and it's 1945, and you're presented with the United Nations Charter. You did what a lot of them didn't do. You read it. Right? You get to Article 25, and you scratch your head after reading this, and you say, I don't know if I'd accept that. Right? Well, if you were a senator in 1945, and you were asked to approve the United Nations Charter that had this as Article 25, would you have agreed to it? What does it say? It said the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present charter. Would you, as a U.S. Senator in 1945? You wouldn't. Okay, you get my vote. You wouldn't. Right? Nobody in this room would. Right? But the point is simply that the United States Senate did, 89-2, agree to that, and to a lot of other things that are in the UN Charter. Right? It's kind of hard to believe. That sentence, and that's the entire Article 25, that trumps the Constitution. Right? Right? Constitution is now here, the UN Charter is up here. Okay. The voting for entry into the UN accomplished in July, or was it early August? I don't know. Right in the summer of 1945. But in December of 1945, another piece of treachery was passed in Congress. It's called the United Nations Participation Act. And hardly anybody in the United States of America today has ever heard of it, except people who listen to the John Birch Society. It has two parts. Part one says that the President of the United States must have the approval of Congress to supply troops for a UN standing army. The UN has always wanted its own army, its own standing army. It never has had one, right? So that really is of no consequence because the UN still doesn't have a standing army. But look at part two. The President shall not be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. And that's what we do all the time, right? The Security Council says jump, and the Congress says, how high? So that was approved in the House by a vote of 344 to 15. Only 15 Congressmen saw fit to say no to that. And one of the leaders was a female, Jessie Sumner from Illinois. And she gave a couple of talks on that were really terrific. And the Senate approved it by voice vote, so in December of 1945, we're already in the United Nations, and now the President has authority given him by Congress to send troops to a United Nations operation whenever the United Nations wants it. They aren't going to necessarily wear blue helmets and have UN patches, but they are going to do the will of the United Nations. Here's Senator Robert Taft. The UN has become a trap. Let's go it alone. He said that, I think, in '48. That's 3 years after he had voted for it. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to the summer of 1945. All right, World War II hadn't ended. It had ended in Europe, but it hadn't ended in the Pacific. We were still fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific. And they hadn't yet dropped the A-bombs that they never should have dropped, in my view. That's something else. But anyhow, what was the attitude of the American people at that time? The Senate voted 89 to 2. So we know what the attitude of the Senate was. What was the attitude of the American people at the time? Well, my own father, I remember very, very vividly. I was 10 years old. I remember him saying, we had World War I, we have World War II, we don't want to have World War III. Let's give this thing a try. Let's give it a go. And that's the way it was sold to the American people. That's the way it was sold to the senators and to congressmen and so forth. We got to do something different, right? How many of those people that said that had read the UN Charter? Nobody, right? There was a great diplomat at the time. His name was J. Reuben Clark. And he spoke out about the UN, saying it's a war organization. It's not a, don't vote for it, and so forth. He had been successful in persuading a couple of senators to vote against the League of Nations way back in 1919, and he was still at it. And what he said is also very important. So, what happened? Well, Secretary of State was Dean Acheson at the time, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. A man that I remember Robert Welch saying, of all of the ones that got tagged with being communists, I was surprised that Dean Acheson never had the label attached to him, because he certainly deserved it. So, what happened? He was the architect of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed in 1949. And it united several nations in Western Europe and the United States and Canada. And one of the things that it said was an attack on any one of them is an attack on all of us, and we go to war if any one of our NATO confreres is attacked, which is, again, a dangerous thing to do. So Dean Acheson was very blunt about it. He said NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations, and it was. You go to the UN Charter, Articles 51, 2, 3, and 4 talk about regional arrangements. Regional arrangements are NATO and SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, that came later. UN Charter, Articles 52, 3, and 4. Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority. Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. Now that means if NATO is sending American troops into some area to wage, whatever they call it, wage peace, I guess they call it, right? That you have to tell the UN, not only after you do it, but before you do it, right? So here we were, involved in this NATO. Harry Truman was the president when the Korean War started, and he said NATO authorized him to send the troops to Korea. Korean War started June 1950. North Korea invades South Korea. UN Security Council says all members send forces. How many sent forces? The United States sent 95% of the forces. There were some Turks, there was some small contingents from a couple of other countries. We supplied the troops. There was no declaration of war. President Truman was asked, how could you do what you're doing? He said, this isn't war, it's a police action. If I can send troops to NATO, I can send troops to Korea. Right? So you see why they started NATO. Right? UN flags were flying during the police action, and the Korean War, we lost tens of thousands of troops in the 3 years that the fighting was going on, but the war still exists. We now still have a couple of tens of thousands, 30, 40,000 troops in South Korea, and they're in a situation where it's kind of like an armistice. There has never been a peace treaty ending the war in Korea. Right? And we see Korea back in the headlines today, don't we? So, then they happily decided, well, we did well with NATO, let's have another one. So they formed the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and President Lyndon Johnson in 1967 said, we are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the CETO Treaty to act to meet the common danger of aggression in Southeast Asia. Okay, now let's go back to what we said before. When you get involved with the United Nations, and you're involved in some sort of a military activity, you have to tell them beforehand what you're going to do, and you have to tell them afterward what you've done. Right? All kinds of people said that about Korea. They said that the enemy knew what we were going to do before we did it. And in Vietnam, finally, it was about 15 years ago, Senator Barry Goldwater published what were called the Rules of Engagement. The rules under which our forces had to operate in Vietnam. Right? I got 17 pages of that out of the congressional record. I read it and it made me want to throw up. It was that bad. We were not allowed to win in Vietnam, and we eventually did lose. It's the only war that America has formally lost in our history. Right? And look how many people died in a losing effort that they didn't have to lose. So Lyndon Johnson told us, we're there because of CETO. We have to tell CETO beforehand what we're going to do. We have to tell them what we've done after we've done it. And we have to be under the rules of engagement. 1991 was Desert Storm. That's the first war against Iraq. You probably don't know, some of you young people, there have been 2 wars against Iraq. In 1991, President George, that should be George H.W. Bush, the older of the 2 Bushes, the Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order. And that world order is only going to get enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations proves to be effective. So we invaded Iraq in 1991, and the war suddenly stopped. We got Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait, neighboring Kuwait to Iraq, and then it was over. And people say, well, why didn't you go all the way to Baghdad and get Saddam Hussein and so forth? They said, well, the only thing that was authorized for us to do was to get him out of Kuwait. So we were obeying the UN. In 2002, they're talking about going back into Iraq. So they had a meeting of the House International Relations Committee. And Congressman Ron Paul of Texas was a member of that committee. He stood up at the meeting and he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. The chairman is Henry Hyde of Chicago. Okay, Ron, what's your motion? I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. All right? At that point, I would applaud and say, good for you,
Yeah.
Ron. Good for you, Ron.
Quick question.
There's the Constitution, right? Here's Chairman Henry Hyde's response.
His question.
He said, Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to a modern society. Your motion is inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. You know what anachronistic means, right? It isn't done anymore. It's an old thing that we don't do anymore. An anachronism, yeah.
I just think my memory refreshed. Ron Paul, is he the Speaker of the House or is that Paul Ryan?
Paul Ryan.
Okay.
Ron Paul is not in Congress anymore.
Okay.
He retired,
Thanks.
right? So, this is incredible. And Henry Hyde of Chicago was supposed to be a good conservative, right? But that's what he said, right? He's willing to say that that part of the Constitution doesn't apply anymore, right? So it's anachronistic, it isn't done anymore. Some people in his district in the Chicago area wrote to him and said, how about that portion of the Constitution that says you shall be paid? Is that an anachronism, right? Has that been wiped away? He didn't answer them. Which is, he really couldn't answer them, right? So let's go back over now. Wars after World War II. World War II is the last war the United States won. Korean War, obvious UN control, flags were flying. UN flags were flying. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, under SEATO, a United Nations operation. Desert Storm, 1991, authorized by the Security Council. Iraq, 2003, and it's still going on, authorized by the UN Security Council. Afghanistan, we started in Afghanistan in 2001, which means that we're there 16 years and we're still there, and now we're under NATO. Is this a betrayal of America's military arm? Absolutely. Now I'm going to shift gears and get away from war and talk about the United Nations itself. There is a United Nations organizational chart. You can't read it. I know you can't read it. You'll have to trust me. Where did I get it? I went to the United Nations. They were passing them out. I asked the guy who gave it to me, can I have some more of those? Well, how many do you want? I said, well, give me a half a dozen. Right? I came back later, I got half a dozen more. But you can photocopy it. Right? What does it show? It shows United Nations involvement in everything. Right? The do-nothing organization is involved in everything, like education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, everything, you name it. And most of these divisions of the United Nations have a huge building somewhere on Earth. Bangkok, Tokyo, Uganda, wherever. Cairo, Geneva in Switzerland. They're everywhere, right? And they're all doing nothing, of course, right? Like we said, it's a do-nothing organization. Here's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was passed in, I don't have my glasses on. When was it? 1948? Yeah, it says 1948. All right? Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been, UN promoters have said it's like the Bill of Rights of the United States. So we look into it, and what do we find? Well, they talk about everyone shall have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, on and on and on you go, right? But they have a qualification in it that's a little bit different, right? The United Nations said rights are granted but are subject to limitations. Because it says over and over again in this that everybody has this right except if it's limited by a law that we passed in the United Nations. And what does the Bill of Rights of the United States say? Congress shall make no law, period. Right? It couldn't be more different. In 1996, they came out with this. This is the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Same thing, list all the rights and say that we can limit it by passing a law. And the United States system is Congress shall make no law. Right? That in itself ought to get us out of the United Nations. So let's make some conclusions here. We'll wind this thing up. The United States Nations is not taking over our country. The United States is being delivered to the United Nations. That's a big distinction, but that's one that has to be known. All right, conclusion number 2. Membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with the maintenance of independence for the United States and freedom for the American people. That's conclusion number 2. So what are we going to do about all this? Conclusion number 3, should we reform the United Nations? Well, do you reform cancer? No, you cut it out, right? Should we reduce our payments? Should we say, no, you can't have as much money as we gave you last year? No, that's not enough, right? Should we find a friendlier Secretary General?
Should we find a friendlier cancer?
Find a friendlier cancer, right? Now, the thing to do is to get us out. And this program was put together when Ron Paul was still in Congress, and that's Ron Paul at the bottom of the petition. He proposed H.R. 1146, a measure to terminate the United States membership in the United Nations. Now, I want to tell you a little story about that and make you feel good if you're a member of the Birch Society. Right? When Ron Paul was in Congress, he at one point tried to become a senator. He failed, so he went back to being a doctor. And he did that for 10 or 12 years, and then he said, I got to get back into Congress, so he ran again, and he got elected. Right? And he had a tough primary, a tough election, and everything else, but he won. And he later told me, he said, I wouldn't have won if it hadn't been for the Birchers. Right? But the day after he won the election, I got a call from a young member of the Birch Society down in, she lives down near Memphis, Tennessee. This is a gal I've known for years. I knew her as a youngster when she was a camper. And she's now in her 50s, I think. Shows you how old she is. Not me, just her. Anyhow, she said she'd like to go to work for Ron Paul. And I said, are you willing to move to Washington, D.C.? She said, yes. I said, okay, I'll do what I can. I had Ron Paul's phone number at his home. I called him, he answered the phone. I congratulated him for his victory, and that's when he told me it wouldn't have occurred if it hadn't been for the Birchers. So I said, I got a young lady who wants to work for you. I said, she's bright, she's well informed, she can write, she can speak, she's very personable, and she's even pretty good looking. And she wants to go. He said, well, what's her name? I told her his name. He said, have her send a resume and we'll see what we can do. She got the job, right? And she worked for Ron Paul for 8 or 10 years, I don't know, quite a while. And she finally decided she couldn't stand it anymore, even working for Ron. So I said, well, what did you do all those 10 years you worked there? She said, well, I answered the phone, I answered letters, I did this, I showed people around, I did a lot of nice things, and it was fun. But she said, I had enough, so I said, well, she said, but I did write one piece of legislation. I said, you did? Which one? She said, I wrote the Get Us Out bill. How did you accomplish that? She said, well, because I'm a staffer with the congressman, I called the Library of Congress, and I asked the Library of Congress to send me a copy of every bill that had ever been introduced in Congress to get us out of the United Nations. So she said, I got a stack of that high, and I read through all of them, and I took the good part of this one, and the good part of that one, the good part of that one, and I put it all together as the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. And I went in and I gave it to Dr. Paul, and I said, I got a piece of legislation here I'd like you to consider. He said, oh? So he said, well, let me look at it. She said he changed one word. One word. I said, what was the word? He said, changed immediately to give him 2 years to get out of the UN. So she wrote the Get Us Out bill, right?
Amazing.
A young member of the John Birch Society. I asked her recently, I said, do you mind if I tell people about that? She says, no, it's okay, go ahead. But I usually refrain from telling you who it was, the name of
Real
the
quick
girl.
question.
Okay.
How
So,
many- oh.
get us out of the UN is what is needed, and anything you can do as a well-informed American, as a member of the Birch Society, whatever you can do. Get one more person, and then another person, and then another person to realize we gotta get out of the United Nations. Robert Welch once said, get the United States out of the United Nations and you have broken the back of the conspiracy against mankind. Yeah.
What were the voting numbers for the Get Us Out bill? You know,
Well, it has never come before the full House. The only thing that we've ever had it accomplished is to get co-sponsors for the bill, not enough to force it to the House for a full vote of the full House.
Yeah. That's
So
always the,
we still got a lot of work to do.
I believe the current number is 193 that they're trying to promote. So there's a few senators trying.
There
House
are
members.
435 members of the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Yeah. A majority would be 218. But then we'd have to get the Senate. And we don't even have a bill in the Senate. We got to get some senators to start this ball rolling towards getting it out. Wait a minute. Yeah.
There is a bill, and Joshua referred to it. There is a bill sponsored by Congressman Thomas Massey from
Right.
Kentucky.
It's the same bill.
Yeah.
It's the same one that my young lady friend wrote.
What's
Yes.
the new number, Jack? What's the new number? You know?
193.
HR 193.
193?
Correct.
Right?
193,
HR 193.
that's it. HR 193.
The American Sovereignty Restoration Act.
And it's the same bill that the young lady wrote way back in whatever.
Do you think Don Trump would sign that act if he got to his desk?
Well, he backed up on NATO, didn't he?
NAFTA.
NAFTA.
Yeah.
No, and NAFTA. But, oh, he originally said NATO is obsolete, we've got to get out of it. He became president, it's not obsolete anymore. He actually said it's not obsolete anymore. All right. Okay, so there we are, and I appreciate you coming and taking a listen to what we have to say about the UN. You can count me as being opposed to membership in the United Nations.
Thank you.
Amen.